It's not for me. Yikes. Good afternoon. You also see another name up there, Bill Probilla, and Bill is, I see actually Bill sitting out there on a chair, but we only brought a handful of copies with us. We didn't expect this many people, so Bill's coordinating getting extra copies. So if somebody does not have a handout, we will get you taken care of before the end of the program. So I'm Dan with Umbaugh. I've been working in local government for about 21 years. I spend, as was described, I spend most of my time in the core accounting and reporting services, supporting our clients and the issues that they face in their daily lives. I help with a lot of the internal accounting and reporting, a lot of the dealing with software. I do a lot of financial modeling, and all of this is a basis for some of the subject matter that we're going to be talking about today. But our topic is internal controls, and by now I assume that everyone has at least heard of internal controls by now, correct? This is an audience participation thing. If I stand up here for a couple hours and just talk to you, none of us are going to have fun. So we're going to, if I don't get some participation, I'll drag it out of you. But our format for today is I do have a presentation that I want to go through, and it's going to go through where you should be now, and then start to talk about charting a path for where you're going to need to go in the future, and then we're going to take a break. And after we take that break, we're going to change the format a little bit and break into smaller groups and allow you to have some dialogue back and forth with your peers about some of these actual internal control processes and procedures, and kind of share your own experiences. Once we set aside time for that, we will come back together and have a Q&A session at the end. Now, having said that, I don't mind questions throughout. I will say this, all of you must have thought this was a Gallagher concert because you're all in the back of the room. If I don't see your hand, make some noise, or somebody that's vocal, yell it out so that I can make sure that I get your questions addressed. I will say one other thing. There's a light blinking ahead, right over my head, and for whatever reason, it's gotten into my conscience, so it keeps throwing me off. But I will persevere, so if you see me just sort of staring off into space, I think it's because I'm mesmerized. You should have two handouts. One is this, which is the PowerPoint presentation that we're going to go over, and the second is this internal control questionnaire, which is a sample. The questionnaire is what we'll be working on in our group session after the break. Is everyone okay with that format? Okay. Yay, all right, who said that? Okay, I don't have anything to throw at you, but this is a thank you, going right at you. All right. So let's get started. I'm told that I've got you for between 2 and 2.5 hours. I will stay on time. If there's questions afterwards, I've got nothing going on after this, so I will answer any questions that you may have. Bill and I will set up shop somewhere. Oh, I was talking about Bill. Bill works with me and spends a lot of time on accounting services as well and internal controls. He also has a background at the Indiana State Board of Accounts, so he's lived the life of visiting your communities for doing audit work, and now he works with us. Yay, Bill. Bill, say hi. Okay. He's also long-winded. So our schedule, we're going to talk about the initial requirements. At this time, I would ask for a show of hands, but I know you won't raise your hands if you're not in compliance. But if there's anyone that is in a county that has not done the initial training and done some of the requirements from last year, find me sometime today and we can talk about your situation and getting you caught up. But at this point, I will recap the initial requirements. We're going to talk about the ongoing requirements and then getting started on internal control procedures. I've got one of the challenges that I have with presentations like this is I've got, I don't know how many counties are here, but there's 92 in the state, so I've probably got a good selection here. So I've got big counties, I've got small counties, I've got highly technology advanced counties, and I've got counties that probably work a lot with paper. So my presentation is geared towards trying to be helpful to all of you, and you'll see that in a few minutes when you see my wonderful clip art. Common questions regarding the new internal control law. Anybody see anything up there that rings a bell? Especially the last one. All right, I will answer that question now. It's not going away. It's here to stay, and I would also argue it's been here all along. We just didn't really shine a light on it like we maybe should have. And I can, if I have time later today, I'll kind of spend some time just framing in the big picture of how the internal control law evolved. But for now, I want to make sure I get through the content first before I start going into some of that. But I want to talk today about why is this required, where should you start, and one of the challenges that you face. Most of you in this room are in the fiscal officer category. Is that fair? Do we have any? Probably don't have any counsel or anything in the room, so we can talk bad about counsel. Is that right? No, we won't do that. We won't do that. But you're in the fiscal officer category, so I'll explain to you on a few slides later exactly what that means from the perspective of the law. Those of you in small counties, how do I separate duties in a small office? I've already talked to one of you today about that, and we'll spend a little bit of time talking about that later. Who needs trained? Got answers to that. When's it due? Are there examples I can copy? This is the one that what I will emphasize over and over and over again. This isn't a fill in the blank, copy your neighbor's homework type law. So hopefully by the end of this presentation, you'll agree with me that that's actually a good thing. Oh, who has this done already? Let's ask that. Who's done? Everyone got their internal code? I see a couple hands. Good for you. And I'm going to ask you again at the end if you're done. Any chance this will just go away? That one I can't answer. No. Couple acknowledgments. There's a hint. All of you should have access to this information. And maybe even print a hard copy for your files, or at least have it electronically stashed somewhere on your network. So the resources that we use, that on the left is the Accounting and Uniform Compliance Manual for counties. The second box is the memo that came from Paul Joyce that described the internal control standards. The third image is the State Board of Accounts internal control document. It's about 80 some pages long. And then that final document may be unfamiliar to you, but this is really the root of everything. That's the federal internal control standards from the Government Accounting Office, GAO. And everything that the state adopted is really based on that document. So if you're one that likes to read, this is also another good document for you to have access to and read. You can find it just by Googling GAO and then the title of Governmental Auditing Standards. All right, oh, there you are. So the initial requirements went in place after June of last year, and this is the actual law. And I know this is a little bit recap. How many of you have been through an internal control presentation already? A couple of you? Okay, but actually not a lot. Okay, so I will take the time and go through this. For some of you, this is review, and for the rest of you, this may be new, but this is the actual Indiana code site that has the law that we're talking about. There's 13 provisions in the law. They're all spelled out, and what I've done, the law, it takes a little bit of time to read, but I bullet pointed for you the parts of the law. So again, this is something that from an internal control standpoint, at least having access to or maybe reading through once or twice would be to your benefit. But the way that the law is set out, there's a lot of definitions as there is in most, but the definition of the legislative body, the definition of material. A little later on I have a place to talk about materiality, but I'll touch on it now. Materiality, actually I'm going to wait because I think it'll fit better later. Definition of personnel, definition of the political subdivision, and then an interesting part of the law, the duty of the State Board of Accounts to define an acceptable level, minimum level of internal control standards, and there's that word and, internal control procedures. Now, if you have a discussion with the State Board of Accounts, they really bristle a little bit about a central body dictating to you what your internal control procedures would be. And that will make sense in about one more slide. But essentially what they're saying is that even though it's in the law that the State Board of Accounts has to establish your minimum level of internal control procedures, they cannot write this for you. They cannot tell you how to establish the internal control procedures that are effective for your organization, because you are unique. Questions so far? No, okay. We're still in the high energy phase, just getting started, not to the boredom phase yet, but that's coming. And when it does, my slides pick up. More of the law. As I said, there's 13 parts to it. The deadline for the State Board of Accounts to develop or designate approved training materials, that's the manual that they put out. The duties of the legislative body, the duties of the fiscal officer, so your duties are spelled out in the law specifically. Duties of the State Board of Accounts during the audit, duties to report material issues to the State Board of Accounts. There's that material word again. What that means is they want to know about the big stuff, but the little stuff you need to handle. Okay, that's materiality. Duty to implement the State Board of Accounts modifications for items found. And how many of you have been through audits before? I know we've got all kinds of experience in the room. When the audit's done, you get a list from the State Board of Accounts of, the conversation essentially goes like this. Here's the things we found, here's the things you need to work on, but they didn't change our opinion. So things like maybe they sampled 10 claims and 3 of them weren't filled out correctly, stuff like that. So what they're saying is it's hardwired into the law now that if they give you audit results and comments, you are required to address those. Whereas before, I think most people, most communities, most counties do address those issues, but there were enough that didn't, that it made it into this law now that those are required to be followed up on. Duty of the public officer to inform State Board of Accounts and prosecuting attorney. This is the fraud provision. If you find it, you have to report it. And then finally, restitution guidance from the Attorney General, which is more of a nothing that any of us in this room can do, but it is written into the law. So that's the law. Now let's read the law a little bit in more basic terms. This information is straight out of the State Board of Accounts Internal Control Manual, and I want to spend some time on this. I know you're reading it off the screen may be difficult, but you've got it in front of you. Anytime you have a question about internal controls, this is one of those slides that you could star and come back to give you the guidance that you need to keep you on track. But within the first sentence is a very important word, and that word is process. So internal controls, this is when we need to start talking more theoretically and make sure that we all digest and understand why internal controls exist. So I'm going to spend a fair amount of time on this slide going through this because I want to make sure that we understand a few things. Internal controls is a process. It's not a fill-in-the-blank test. It's not a copy off your neighbor. It's not a, hey, does somebody have a process on bank rec procedures and you just change the name and make that your process. It is a living part of your organizational culture. So now we're starting to get weird. That's not what we're used to. We're used to reconcile the bank statement, go on to the next thing, do this task, pay the bills, bring in the money, all these things that kind of have a defined beginning, middle, and end. Internal controls aren't that way. Internal controls are woven into the culture of your organization. And we're going to spend, I keep saying this, we're going to. Eventually I'm going to have to actually talk about it. But I have some parts in here where we start to cement those concepts of why this is a process and not just an actual event. So earlier when I asked if people were done, a few raised their hands and I would agree with that, but internal controls I would assert are never finished. And pretty soon I'm going to show you the cube and I'll explain why. So internal controls is a process, key word, executed by officials and employees. So there is no single person or entity responsible. It is a group effort, officials and employees, that's designed to provide reasonable assurance, another key phrase, reasonable assurance. Internal controls will not prevent everything. And when we say prevent things, usually we're talking about fraud. So internal controls by itself won't prevent fraud, but they will help you detect. And I would also maybe put a different spin on internal controls, that internal controls for the vast majority of us that do things correctly is a layer of protection. So our duties are defined, our responsibilities are clear, our place in the organization is known. So that gives us a little bit of comfort and security that the work that we do is protected, that our efforts are protected because we have policies and procedures in place that actually define that protection. So the internal control process, again, includes any policy, system, or action that corresponds directly to the objectives of the organization and adjusts to change when necessary. This is a long-winded way of saying you're never done. Internal controls are here to stay. Even if you put in the perfect internal control over something, pick it out, bank recs. You have the perfect internal control over bank recs. What happens if you change accounting software? Now you got to go rewrite it. So it's ever changing, always evolving. That's what this sentence tries to convey. So the State Board of Accounts, they're a little bit more like us. They like bullet points, they like sentences, and they like more declarative information. But if you read closely, they're saying the same thing over again, just differently. Internal control is a process executed by officials and employees that is designed to provide reasonable assurance that the objectives of the political subdivision will be achieved. We just read that in the paragraph. It's a basic element fundamental to the organization rather than a list of added on tasks. And I do want to spend a moment and emphasize this, that if internal controls isn't going to be something that you add to the end of your day to make sure that you did. It is going to be woven into everything that you do throughout the day. So if you can pick a basic task in your own mind of something that you do every day, and whether it be fill out a timesheet or prepare an AP voucher or open mail, whatever it may be. Each one of those processes, each one of those things that you do, they're, according to this new culture, we should make an effort to document what we do, the steps that we do, and why we do it. And if there's somebody reviewing it, they should take the time to document what they did, how they reviewed it, and their form of review. Sometimes that's just initials, sometimes it's signing a docket, sometimes it's signing a check, but all those procedures exist and are actually woven into your day already. So my point with that is that many of you, as you work throughout the day and do your daily tasks that you're doing already, are already demonstrating internal controls. You just don't know it. So part of the emphasis of this is to really think through the things that we do every day and document over time, because it's a process, exactly how you do that. Has anybody ever been to a class where you had to tell an instructor how to make a peanut butter sandwich? Has anybody ever done that exercise? Okay, that's a fascinating exercise. So I'll just summarize it this way. So internal controls, think of internal controls as making a peanut butter sandwich. All of us know how to make a peanut butter sandwich, right? Just say yes. It's audience interaction here. All of us know how to make a peanut butter sandwich. If there's anybody allergic to peanut butter, feel free to substitute Nutella into this equation. That's not going to offend me. All right. So if we all know how to make a peanut butter sandwich, then what's the first step? Make sure we have the ingredients, okay. We'll call that the first step. What's the second step? Get the bread out, okay. What's the third step? Open the peanut butter, okay. I'm quickly, somebody keep track of these steps. What's the fourth step? What's that? Cut the crust off. Okay. Been there. All right. So let's fast forward here. So we all have an idea in our head of how to make a peanut butter sandwich. So when I did the exercise, my instructions were basically this. Get a piece of bread. Put the peanut butter on the bread. Take another piece of bread, put it on top. So the person that I wrote the instructions for did it this way. Got a piece of bread, took the jar of peanut butter, put it on the piece of bread, took another piece of bread, put it on top of the jar of peanut butter, because that's exactly what I told her to do. So my point with this is that the things that we take for granted that everybody knows, internal controls is an exercise to assume, forgive me, that everyone is clueless and that they have to be led around by the nose, step by step, as clear as possible, so that everyone would make a uniform peanut butter sandwich, regardless of any other context. They would take our instructions and follow it the same way each time and always arrive at the same conclusion. So think about that as you're doing your daily tasks and the steps that you do, and as you get into the weeds of this when you go back to your daily lives. Think of making that peanut butter sandwich. But what really stunk about that exercise for me, I'll just share this, is when we did that exercise, you got to eat it at the end. So what did I have? I had two just pieces of blank bread and a jar of peanut butter I couldn't do anything with. So I remembered that all these years. Sad. Okay. So internal controls focus on the achievement of objectives. Achievement of objectives, I want to come back to that word in a minute. And it is dependent on officials and employees for effective implementation. So we can write up the best formula to make a peanut butter sandwich that's ever been known to mankind. If nobody uses it, it's worthless. That's the concept here. We can write down the best procedures of how to do something. If we don't follow it, it's worthless. If we tell our organization, if we train our employees that you are going to do this, then this, then this, and then an auditor comes in and finds out that you do this, then that, then the other, then what effectiveness is the internal control that you spend so much time to develop? So without the actions and the efforts and the continuous efforts of your officials and employees, this is really a waste of time. And none of us have, well, maybe some of you do. How many of you have a lot of time to waste? Audience interaction. You do? Who said that? Well, yeah, you're an exception. You're the exception that proves the rule. All right, another thing that I want to spend some time on is this little guy here. Now, I've given this presentation or some like it several times, and this one, because I have so much time, I'm going a little bit slower than what I normally do. And actually, I kind of like that. But this is the cube, and you'll find this in the COSO manual, which is from the GAO office, one of the pictures that I showed you earlier. And I think you may also find a similar version in the State Board of Accounts manual. I can't remember, and I didn't bring mine. But this cements some of the concepts I've been talking about, that internal controls are a process. They're part of our culture, they're woven in, and that's represented in this sort of three-dimensional object here, that you can't do one thing without affecting the other, and everything is related, and all these sort of woven in concepts and words. But what you'll see is there's three sides to this cube, and I'm sure there's stuff on the other sides as well, they're just not showing it. But there's categories of objectives, there's levels of organizational structure, and there's components of internal control. So the way that this works is that the categories of objectives say that the reason that we have internal controls from the highest level is for better operations, better reporting, and for compliance. Each of you has an external report that you have to prepare each year. That's compliance. That report is dependent, the usefulness of that report is dependent on having policies and procedures in place during the year so that you capture data correctly, put it in the right spot, that you spend dollars correctly, put them in the right spot, so at the end of the year can add up all those numbers and report information to the state that is actually usable. That's compliance. Reporting could be internal or external. We gave an external example, but even department reports, if you share them with department heads, or reports to your boards and councils. All of that information is useful if the processes and procedures that develop the information are reliable. And operations. So internal controls help operations. And a good example of this, and there's several, but one example is that if we get an invoice to be processed for payment we know that at some point there has been a purchase order and that somebody has weighed in, and if we order goods and services, somebody has actually matched up those goods against deliveries to make sure that we actually got what we paid for. So it helps our operations and the reliability of our operations. So the categories of objectives from a big picture standpoint is to, again, just to recap, to improve our operations, to help with internal and external reporting, and to cement some of our compliance issues that we deal with throughout the year. The side, levels of organizational structure, the purpose of this portion of the cube is to discuss that this isn't your sole responsibility as the fiscal officer. Now, some of you may feel like it's all falling on you. How many of you have that perception? Okay, enough hands in the air to prove my point. But internal controls are an entity-wide issue. They're division, or for you that might be a department. Operating unit, to me, I'm interpreting that at the fund level. And then function. You've got different functions you perform: highways and streets, public safety, general government. Every possible dimension of your organization is affected and required to have some level of internal controls. So very simple. When you take a vote at a public meeting, we do a roll call on the vote and we record the yeas or nays. That's an internal control. If that didn't exist, if there wasn't somebody there that actually took the time to do that, then later on we would open ourselves up to any level of challenges from, hey, is this a valid ordinance or a valid resolution or not? So again, that's an example of an internal control that you already do, just maybe didn't really think of it in that context. And that's an entity-wide issue. The different components of internal control, these are all interwoven. Control environment, risk assessment, control activities, information and communication, and monitoring. Where they get you is the monitoring. You have got to develop policies, procedures. Some of you, all of you already have policies and procedures that you do. And again, you may write the best process to make a peanut butter sandwich, but if something comes along and peanut butter quits coming in jars and starts coming in, what else would it come in? Packets. Now you got to go back and change your process because you're dealing with packets instead of jars. So monitoring and ongoing efforts is always going to be there no matter what. And they're going to sneak up on you, little subtle things. It's probably been longer ago than I realized, but Gateway. It used to be, when I started, we did our annual financial reports literally by hand. And fortunately, I didn't have to do any of them because I had terrible handwriting. So it always went to the people that had good handwriting. So I was able to just give them the numbers and they'd write it in nicely. But now we have Gateway. So nothing is done by hand anymore. So if, back in our history, if we had an internal control over preparing the annual report, we would have had to evolve that because of the changes, the external changes for our organization. Does this cube make some sense to you? That was I know I can count on you. Thank you. I appreciate it. So again, this concept, for those of us, and I'm in this category, believe me, I'm in the show me what to do, I'll get it done, and it's done category. I love that. It's part of my type A accounting world. This isn't that. This, as I said, is dimensional, it's ongoing, it's part of your everyday procedures, and it's here to stay. All right. This is another slide that is very helpful, and I would recommend that you either put it somewhere electronically where you can get at it often, or take a copy of it and maybe stick it to a bulletin board or put it under the blotter on your desk, because these are things that will help over time as our collective vocabulary on the issue, on internal controls, grows, and as our experience dealing with internal control standards and ongoing internal control monitoring, as those continue to evolve. All of it, every single piece of it is going to come back to these 5 components that we talked about on the cube, and now I'm introducing 17 principles of internal control. Now, the principles, as you go through them, I've read through them, and most of them are kind of intuitive. They make sense. And I'll just read the first one. The oversight body of management should demonstrate a commitment to integrity and ethical values. How many of us would argue with that? Not you. I was just picking on you. The one time you weren't looking up here, I picked on you. So I missed my chance. No, you had your chance. All right, so the oversight body of management should demonstrate a commitment to integrity and ethical values. All that makes sense. None of us would vehemently fight that. And then you can go down, all of the rest of them are the same. The oversight body should oversee the entity's internal control system. Yeah, somebody needs to be watching this. And on down the line. So everything we talk about with internal controls is going to come back to these 5 components and these 17 principles. One of our challenges is that, and again, the way I'm wired is if I have an internal control, I want to match it up to one component, one principle. But what you're going to find is that even that is a difficult task because it's all woven. So in a second, as we go through a couple of these examples, I'll be able to give you a good example of that. So again, star this one, it's already, what do you call that, sticky pen that says it's important. But this is one that when you get back to your office, photocopy, distribute to your staff, distribute to those that are part of management, and encourage them to just have this available because we're going to refer back to it a lot. I'll take a sidebar here. I've got some clients that we work with that as they write ordinances or resolutions, they're looking at this and trying to match the ordinance or resolution for their action to these internal controls because they want to be able to demonstrate to the State Board of Accounts or their auditor how they are living this new culture. So they're trying to take the proactive step to match things up. Sometimes that step is more frustrating than it is easy because, again, things seem to cross so many different objectives and principles, but they are at least conscious of that relationship and are trying to make those connections. So again, important slide. We're all the same except we're all different. In this room, we have all different sizes of organizations, and I know that. But at the end of the day, all of us are following the same framework, but we're going to follow it differently. As an example, if we all decide that we're going to go downtown tonight and meet at St. Elmo's for dinner, all of us are going to get there, but we're all going to do it different ways. Some of you will ride together, some of you would ride by yourself, some of you would take Meridian, some of you would take the Interstate to I-70. We're all going to have different paths to get to the same destination. It's the same with internal controls. Some of you are not going to be able to separate duties effectively. We get that. State Board of Accounts gets that. And while their role is to not let up on the standards, there's also a recognition that we can't do more if we don't have all the resources to do that. So what your challenge is when you're short on resources, if you're a one-person office, or if you've got a department that's a one-person office and handles cash, well, it's hard to separate duties if you're the only person there. So what you have to do is get creative and either lend a resource or involve a board or a council to help be part of the management chain and the review chain to accomplish an objective, but maybe not in the most academic way that could be accomplished in an organization that has unlimited, if you will, resources. So that's the purpose behind that first bullet point, is that the conceptual framework for internal controls is applicable to all political subdivisions. And this doesn't matter whether you're counties, cities, towns, libraries, schools, we're all working off the same book now. The actual internal control policies and procedures are unique to each political subdivision. Again, we know where we need to get to over time. All of us are going to get there differently. Some of us are going to take a lot longer to get there. Others of you can get it done pretty quickly. We've already seen that in this room. We've got some over here in the corner that have been through this and are done, and hopefully what I'm saying today is cementing their experience. And we've got others that are really just starting this journey. But we're all going to get there. And there is no due date. Have I said that yet? There is no due date. There's not a test. This is a culture change. It is a way of doing business change. Your test, your midterms, your whatever, are every time that you have an audit. So if the State Board of Accounts shows up and they see that you're making progress, they're going to give you some feedback. They may have issues with your progress, and that's okay. But if they come back the next time and you've done nothing, then there's going to be a problem. So this has got to be a continuous evolution of effort. I remember when I made this image, I was so proud of myself. It took forever because I'm not very good with some of these PowerPoint tools, but I learned a lot. So what I want to illustrate with this is the last few slides, just to kind of try to bring it all home. You see the cube there that has the components, the objectives, and the levels of organizational inputs, and how that applies to this pyramid. So we have three categories. The operations, reporting, and compliance that we talked about on our cube. There's 5 components that are also on the cube, and there's 17 principles, which are the handout I showed you a couple slides ago. That's the basic that everyone has. And again, if you are working in the county and you decide to go over to the city just to see how they're doing things for today, they're going to have the same materials to start out with that you do. Same manual, same principles, same components, everything. Now the procedures are going to be unique to each unit. You may be a unit that does a very good job of documenting everything, so you've got a lot of written procedures and they're organized and tabulated and cross-referenced, and that's all great. Or you may be a community that has a lot of procedures built into your software, so that in order for you to approve things, it has to go through this check procedure, this check procedure, this check procedure, and there's different electronic forms of verification along the way. Both of those are fine, as long as you're doing them. So the procedures, there's going to be a lot. Going to be in a lot of different categories. As soon as you think you're done, you'll think of something else that you can write up. And it's going to vary by each unit, and it is ongoing, as I say on the right side of this. When we sit here 10 years from now, for those of you that will still be around, that haven't retired yet or won the lottery, I think I'll probably still be here. But we're going to be talking about this again. We'll be talking about new procedures and refining internal controls. It's just going to be part of our culture going forward. Okay. These next few slides we can probably get through relatively quickly because they're at this point, they're history. What I want you to do as I go through these slides, again, relatively quickly, is I just want you to make mental check boxes in your head as to whether you've done these or not. And if you don't know, or if you know that the answer is we haven't done these, then find me or Bill so we can at least give you some coaching on how to get caught up. So step 1, adopt the standards and procedures. This was the responsibility of the legislative body. Most of them did this as an ordinance or a resolution. Just show of hands, how many people actually did an ordinance for this? Okay. I would say, well, that's probably about half. So is it fair to say the other half did resolutions? Raise your hand. Other half did nothing? Is there another way to do it besides an ordinance or a resolution? Okay, the reason I asked was because within our walls, and I monitor a lot of traffic back and forth about whether this should be an ordinance or a resolution, and I don't know that we ever got to a final answer, but where we came down is that most units adopted ordinances. So the legislative body shall stipulate in policy that they've adopted the internal control standards, which is essentially that book that the State Board of Accounts put out, and it had to be in place by June of last year. Second thing you were supposed to do is conduct training on standards and procedures. And that training, what most of our units did was they just decided, you know what, we're just going to train everybody. They made them sit down and watch that 30-minute State Board of Accounts video. How many of you have seen that? How many of you have seen it more than once? How many of you hate it? Okay. Well, I will give credit where credit is due. It was necessary. The State Board of Accounts met their charge, and at least we have one spot that we can go back to where everyone's hearing the same thing. And it's also a good tool. How many of you have implemented it so that any new hire, as part of their onboarding, watches that video? Okay, good, good. How many of you have situations, or how many of you have a procedure in place where they have to watch it as a refresher every so often? Okay, at least one of you, I saw a hand. I do have some units that are writing into their internal control procedures that everyone will be refreshed about every other year. They thought if they made it every year that people would revolt. 2 years is apparently just long enough to forget about it and then watch it again. So just think about that as you go back to your communities and counties. Conduct training on standards and procedures and who and how, talk about that. And then the fiscal officer. So all of you had to certify in writing that this got done. So there was a form, as I recall, that spelled out what was trained and when. And one of the questions I got the most on this, and I didn't anticipate this, but I'll just share it now. Since there's 3 lines there, I got a lot of questions about, well, do we have to have 3 different training events? And the answer is no. The 3 lines are there probably because the person that created the form felt that they had room for 3 lines, and that they thought maybe all of us were overachievers and would have 2 or 3 different forms of training. So all of you should have this on file for the people that were trained and available if asked by the State Board of Accounts or your auditor if you're not audited by the State Board of Accounts. And finally, I think you had to upload something in the gateway, didn't you? Yes? Did you had to upload, what did you have to upload? So you had to upload something in the gateway, didn't you? Somebody said it, but I still didn't hear it. Yeah, yes. I knew there was something. Okay, that's all history. So everyone in the room has either had the little checked all the boxes that, yep, good, 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 done, 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 or you've had that, uh-oh, crap, holy moment, and we'll deal with you at break. Ongoing requirements. This is an ongoing process with no specific due dates, period. Don't think of this as a test and we're done. This is not a test and we're done. This is part of our woven into our culture and how we're going to do things going forward. Anybody have any questions or comments so far before we get into part 2? Can everybody hear me okay? Now's the time to ask that since I'm halfway through the presentation. A little bit louder? Okay. This thing keeps falling. You hear that? That's right. I told you this is audience interaction. I'll either get you involved or scare the crap out of you with a mic. All right, I will make an effort to ensure that I can be heard. Time-wise, it looks like we're doing okay. I know that I have 44 slides, and I think we're on slide 16 or 17. So for those of you that do the math about, well, if there's 44 slides and we're on 16, you need to do the math out that, oh, this is going to take frickin' forever to get through. This isn't that kind of presentation. Some of these slides we're going to blow through real quick. So don't get too discouraged by how slow this first part went. Yes, ma'am. I don't know. No, it's just one upload, but you've got to have those 50 certifications available. and I know this question will probably come up later, so I'll just address it now. Some of you have officials that may also serve in a different capacity in another unit. And where we ultimately came down on that after conversations with the State Board of Accounts is that we needed to ensure that that person was trained, and it didn't necessarily matter if they were trained by you or their other hat, but since you are the ones that are certifying, you needed to be comfortable that they actually did get that training. So if you weren't comfortable about that, or if you felt like they were just trying to get over, then you had the duty to compel them to be trained under your roof. So I don't know if any of you went into that. I know we had those discussions back and forth in several communities and several counties, but I think where they came down is if they have different hats, they just really need to be trained once, and the fiscal officers just need to be comfortable that that actually happened. So some communication. Yes, Barbara.
The other part of that question is it has to be filed with the annual financial report.
Mm-hmm.
At the beginning of 2017, so with the 2017 annual report, that was good in 2018.
It was the 2016 annual report that you filed in early 2017. Yeah. You are welcome. Okay, so let's talk about ongoing requirements. All right. I know I'm getting redundant saying this is an ongoing process, but we did have a conversation with the State Board of Accounts last year. I just wanted to make sure about when they were going to start grading this pretty hard. And the feedback that I got is that units have to get started, and they have to show progress, and this has to be woven into your culture of how you do things. And if you met those standards, then the actual form of the volume of policies that you've created or the procedures that you've documented, that wasn't their first test. So they're not looking for 20 procedures or 10 procedures or 13 policies or anything like that. What they're looking for is evidence that this matters to you and that you're living under the internal control framework. There's a sub-bullet point that there are examples contained in Part 2, Section 2 of the Uniform Internal Control Standards for Indiana Political Subdivisions. You've got with you this questionnaire, and Part 2 of their manual, there's, I think, 100, and Bill may have to help me, but there's 130 or 140 different internal control procedure examples that they list, and we developed this questionnaire based on that part of the manual. So it is a way to help walk you through some of the things that they're looking for to sort of draw out some areas where you already have some internal controls and other areas where you may find that you have some holes. So the State Board of Accounts is recommending that you document your existing policies and procedures. Now, again, you have a lot of things that you do every day, and you may, in some respects, be on autopilot with those procedures and policies. But what we are suggesting, based on the law and based on this internal control framework, is that where you have habit, we've always done it that way, where you have tradition or where you have autopilot, that you take the time to write down what you're doing. And again, you don't have to be perfect. So I'll try to give an example. Let's say that I had a good example. Let's just go with opening the mail. So mail comes in, we open it, and we do stuff with it. That's our process, right? So maybe a little deeper. Mail comes in, who opens it? What's the job title of the person that opens it? I would stay away from putting in people's names because, as people change or move around, you don't want to have to go back and find every instance of that person's name and have to change all of your policies and procedures. So mail comes in, we open it, we do stuff with it. All right, mail comes in, who opens it specifically? Write that down. We do stuff with it. So what's the stuff that we do? We separate money from support. We put the bills in one stack, we put the money in one stack, we put general correspondence in another stack, whatever that may be. And who does it? Maybe what time of day do they do it? Maybe they're locked in a room when they do it. Whatever those procedures are. But you can start very general and then get very specific over time. So open in the mail. We get the mail, we open it, we do stuff with it. Okay, write that down. Then go back and say, all right, who gets the mail? What specifically do they do with it? And what are we trying to achieve? So when we open the mail, one of the things we're trying to achieve is that we get anybody that paid us money, we want to get that deposited, right? So we put that in a different process and send it off to make sure that it gets captured correctly into the accounting system correctly and into the bank on a timely basis. Invoices the same way. We've got a process where we open the mail, separate the invoices, make sure the invoices are valid, kind of read through them, make sure that there's the correct level of input from the person authorizing the payment. All of those are different processes that you do, but you do them on autopilot. So what we want to do over time is start thinking about those things that you do on autopilot and start writing them down in sequence. And there's advantages to doing this, by the way. One of the advantages is that if you go on vacation, somebody can actually do your stuff so it's not waiting for you when you get back. So cross-training. Job description. Process improvement. You know, if there's a better way to make a peanut butter sandwich, if we know how we make it now, there might be a better way or a process improvement that we can identify if we have all the steps written down. Now I'm back in the State Board of Accounts manual. Step 1 is to review the internal control consideration found in Section 2, pages 1 to 17 of this manual. Now, I don't have the manual with me, and I don't have it on my computer to pull up and show you. But the Section 2 walks through all of the 5 components and 17 principles. So think back to the slide that we showed earlier. It walks through each one of those and gives examples. So that's the place to start, is to think through those. It also corresponds with this questionnaire. Step 2, assemble existing documentation. What you're going to find when you go through this step, when you really get into it and assemble your teams, is that you've got a lot of internal control information already. It's just not perceived or acknowledged as internal control information. As an example, how many of you have an organizational chart? A lot of you. That's an internal control. How many of you have job descriptions for your employees? That's an internal control. How many of you make sure that invoices are approved before you pay them? That's an internal control. You have a lot of these already. What you may not have is just a perception or a context of how all that fits into this big picture. So over time, we're going to be able to infuse that context of internal controls in the daily things that we do. And this will happen, again, over time. Step 3, note missing or incomplete information. If you go through this questionnaire, and we're going to get into groups later, if we go through a questionnaire and we have absolutely no internal controls over monitoring, then that's the place where I'd start. So if nobody ever goes back and looks at what you're doing or tests an internal control to make sure that it's actually effective, then that would be the first place that you would start in order to make improvements in your individual organizations. And then step 4, systematically address weaknesses. Again, this is, if for some reason I'll just pick a silly example. If for some reason we pay bills without ever looking at the what they're for, that's a weakness that we should address right away. And by going through this process, if by chance that situation existed in your organization, it would jump out quicker by looking through this questionnaire. So that's the basics of getting started. This graph or picture, whatever it is, again, just cements that we're going to be doing this for a while. Don't feel like you got to have this done tomorrow, but you do need to get started today. Okay? Oops. See, that's part 2, real quick. Getting started on internal control procedures. There's that word again, ongoing, process. So the question I get asked a lot is, well, how do we actually physically do all this? And here's where I want to start having that discussion. There is no right way and there is no wrong way. Well, the only wrong way is to do nothing. And there is no best practice because, again, it's going to depend on your individual organizations. So conceptually, we've got to have some sort of a repository or some sort of a place where we can have documented procedures that we can gain access to. And I don't think anyone really cares whether that's a physical binder, whether it's someplace that's on the cloud or on your organization system that everybody has access to, an intranet, whatever it may be, file or a network drive. No one really cares as long as there's some thought behind it. So I'll give an example. We have a client that we're working with that, as we're sitting in the meeting, all these things just started coming out about, well, this is how we do this is how we do that, and they're like, oh, we're never going to remember this. So we talked about with them, just set up an email account with your organization, internalcontrols@myorganization.com. And as those thoughts pop in your head, send yourself an email and just get it in the spot, get it quarantined by itself. And then when you have the time to think about internal controls, once a month, twice a month, once a quarter, at least annually, that you at least have a place that you can go to where you've collected data throughout the year to kind of help you along this path. Does that make sense? So put some tools in place to at least help you, whether that be an email account or draft somebody that you send everything to and they assemble it for when you have more formal meetings, but just as a way to capture things. The next time you go back and you do something that you do on autopilot, get out a little pad of paper and just write down the high-level steps of what you do. So maybe what you can interpret from this is, don't make this an impossible task. Don't feel like you've got to be perfect out of the gate. Just know that you have to get started. Share your networks. Talk with each other. When you're at conferences like this, I know you have listserv. All those different things are different tools and different ways that you can help, or that can help you. So create an internal controls binder. And that binder, again, binder, I'm using this word really conceptually, not as a physical document. So binder could be an actual binder. It could be a place on your intranet. It could be a data drive on your shared network. It could be 10 binders, one in each department. It doesn't necessarily matter. Just give some thought to what's going to work for your organization. The organization of the binder, when I first went through this exercise, I thought, well, hey, this is easy. I'll have a binder. I'll put 5 tabs in it, one for each component, and I'll have tabs within those for each principle. So I'll have 5 components, 17 principles, and as I get stuff, I'll just start shoving it into the right tab. I'm going to have the best thing ever. They're going to write books about me. Then I wrote my first process, and I was like, well, this fits about 4 different places. So then I came up with the brilliant idea of maybe an extra tab for other. And what I soon found is that everything was going into other and nothing was in my organized tabs. And I reflected on that and decided that was okay. Because the more important thing is that we were starting to develop a database of information and a database of processes that we could actually pull off the shelf, whether it be physically off the shelf or electronically out of some repository, that gave us a starting point. So if somebody came to me and said, Dan, how do you process mail? I'm not just looking up the ceiling to try to remember from memory. I'm pulling from a document that we at least gave some thought to. And again, it doesn't have to be perfect. Over time, we can shoot for perfect, but we really just have to have something. So you could organize it by the component and the principles. You can organize it by activity, cash, receipts, disbursements, payroll, credit cards, inventory, whatever, by principle, or a cross-reference combination of the above. For those of you that have IT departments, this would be an opportunity for keywords in any sort of a relational search. So keywords, internal controls. Keyword, an objective. Keyword, cash. Keyword, whatever. So you have a way to draw that information out later. Oh, I already gave this one away. set up a common repository to capture documentation, email account, voicemail extension, like a Dropbox or something that you have access to. And again, this is just for those moments, like if you're sitting at a conference like this, you're like, oh, wow, we really need to get that cache process cleaned up. Send yourself an email. The benefit of that, by the way, is one of the components of internal control is ongoing monitoring and activities. If you can demonstrate that, hey, I've emailed myself 50 times throughout the year, specifically on internal control issues, you're actually demonstrating that throughout the year this has meant something to you. So you've got a little check mark in the monitoring area of internal controls. Management is engaged, which is one of the principles somewhere in here. Does that make sense? Okay. We're getting close to a break. Sample layout of a binder, blah, blah, blah. Sample tabs. Now these, and I'm not going to go through these in detail, but the way that I organize this, and this is just to get your juices flowing and get your thoughts going in a maybe a common direction, is that if I were creating a control environment folder or a control environment area on my network, I would organize it around the principles within the control environment. And that's what you're seeing listed on this slide. So this would be a way that you could organize your data. Tab 2, risk assessment. Control activities. By the way, control activities, that's the one where we just have a bunch of them. You do this stuff every day. You just don't necessarily realize you do it. Most of you lock the door when you leave. That's an internal control. Do you ever write down that you lock the door when you leave? Probably not, but it is an internal control. You shut off your computer or you have it set up so that it sleeps while you're gone. You have a password to get into your computer. Parenthetically, don't put your password on the back of your monitor, or at least move it when the auditors are there. Don't share your password. All that stuff is in here. These are things that we already know. We just haven't really looked at them through the lens of this internal control law. Control activities, information and communication, and monitoring, the fifth one. I've got some time reserved in here where we could, this is when we come back from our break, we'll pick up a little bit here. So what I want to do is, we're at a point where we can take a structured break. How much time do you want to allow? That looks like 10 to me. Yes, ma'am. Tell me when to stop. Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah, I did kind of go past that one pretty quickly, didn't I? Yeah. Let me go through this. Let me go through this slide, and I apologize that I flipped right past it. So I've touched on this in different ways, but there actually is some teeth to this that I haven't really bared at this point. That this is a process, and you do need to get started, and there is no, as I said, there is no finish line. There are grading points along the way, but if your organization does not make progress, the consequences are defined in the law as to what could happen. So one is you'll get an audit comment. Well, for some of us, you know, if you've been around a while, an audit comment maybe isn't the scariest thing to you because you know you can just fix it. You know, you can address it and it'll be solved by the next one. And for most of you, that's all it's going to take. That's all it's going to take. Somebody's going to say you didn't do it right. You're going to be like, well, I'm going to get it right next time. And you'll get it right next time. A 60-day compliance window. If the State Board of Accounts comes in and determines that you have done nothing and that they don't see any evidence at all of an organizational effort towards achieving an internal control culture, then they can establish a 60-day compliance window and spell out for you exactly what you need to have done in 60 days. And if you don't have that, they can go on to the third thing, which is they can involve the DLGF and start screwing around with your budget. So there are some teeth here. I don't think that we will need to see those teeth very often, but they do exist, okay? It's a deterrent. Okay, so we are going to take a break, and when we come back from the break, I'll have just a couple minutes, I'll get you oriented, but we're going to break off into groups, and we're going to try to divide the room so it's kind of front to back, groups of six to 8 people. We're going to go through the questionnaire, and you guys are going to start sharing your experiences with each other. Bill and I will be walking around to answer any questions and provide any input that we may have based on your questions. And then we're going to reserve some time to all get back together as a group and have a little free-form Q&A. Okay? Does that plan work for everyone? All right. I have quarter after.